A lot of people are confused about grapeseed oil. It sounds healthy. The omega-6 to omega-3 ratio in grapeseed oil is 700 to 1. Restaurants have notoriously thin margins, and so
Yeah.
they're looking to cut costs wherever they can, and soybean oil is a very cheap oil.
Okay.
When I eat bread, I will occasionally, I'll go and I'll buy like grain-free breads. They now have a number of great products
Mm-hmm.
that are grain-free and taste like
The same.
just as good as any bread you've ever had.
Crunchy, gooey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shout out to Misfits Bakehouse.
Oh, yeah.
We're fans of theirs.
Delicious.
They make great like almond flour and coconut flour based breads
The
that are super tasty.
the only benefit of going that route though is to avoid the gluten. There's no nutritional benefit to a gluten-free bread either, is there?
Well, you have breads that are grain free and you have breads that are gluten free. And a grain free bread is always going to be gluten free, but a gluten free
Okay.
bread isn't necessarily grain free.
Grain-free.
And if you buy gluten free bread that is made of, say, white rice flour,
Mm-hmm.
then it's going to be gluten free. And I'm glad that we have these options for people with true celiac disease.
Yeah.
But very nutrient poor, very high glycemic index,
Okay.
just as refined, just as processed.
Okay.
And so, yeah, that's not a good. Just gluten-free bread is not a smart choice. What I
Okay.
choose to eat sometimes when I'm craving bread is I'll do like a grain-free but almond flour and coconut flour based bread.
Okay.
Because almond flour I think adds a nutrient density to it that wouldn't otherwise be there. Almonds are rich in vitamin E, magnesium, healthy fats,
Okay. And
prebiotic fiber.
that's all still there within the process of making the almond flour that stays
Yes.
intact.
Yeah, that stays intact.
Okay.
For the most part. And then
Good to know.
and then coconut flour, which is very high fiber. Yeah.
Okay.
You tend not to get the addition of grain and seed oils like corn oil, soybean oil, canola oil in those breads, just because the producers tend to be a little bit more mindful of their clientele
Right.
who skew health conscious.
Mm-hmm.
So that's typically what I reach for. The problem, the downside is that those breads can be more expensive.
Definitely.
So that's certainly true.
Okay. One comes to mind that I do want to ask about that's kind of been around for a good bit of time is Ezekiel bread. That is like marketed as like low glycemic index, but it's not, I don't know, I don't know the label, but like I don't think it's gluten free.
No, it's not gluten free.
Yeah.
Those kinds of breads are usually made with quote unquote ancient grains, sometimes einkorn, which is a phenomenal kind of wheat. It's the oldest
Okay.
wheat that I think is still currently in the food supply, but it could be a little bit difficult to find.
Okay.
They also sprout their wheat, which reduces some of the phytic acid, some of the anti-nutrients in wheat.
Mm-hmm.
So those are definitely better options.
If you don't necessarily have a gluten allergy.
Yeah, exactly. Those are
Okay.
definitely better options.
Okay. I did a little bit ago, you had mentioned starch and like white bread being high in starch because of what part of the wheat they
The
use.
endosperm, yeah.
What about the like kind of the relationship between starch and fiber in a bread? Like what role does that play? Like higher fiber breads versus like I don't know if there's any fiber in like a white Wonder bread.
No, they strip out the fiber typically in white bread. They take out the bran, they take out the germ.
Mhm.
And it's the bran in particular that gives us the fiber found in bread.
Okay.
And the kind of fiber found in bread is primarily insoluble fiber. So it can actually be difficult for some people to digest. A lot of people don't digest the bran in bread or brown rice for that matter super easily. And that's also where you find the anti-nutrients and also a bunch of the B vitamins as well in bread,
Okay.
in the germ as well as in the bran. So you do get some insoluble fiber in bread, but it's not much. And still, if you look at whole wheat bread, it has a glycemic index higher than table sugar. Whole wheat bread.
Okay. That's
Yeah.
not great.
No, it's not great. I mean, glycemic index doesn't have a ton of real world relevance because we don't eat single foods in isolation, and that's how the glycemic index was originally devised.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it looks at the rate at which a food spikes your blood sugar independent of other foods. But
Okay.
you don't eat bread, well, especially not bread, right? You don't eat bread by itself.
No.
For the most part, you eat it as part of a sandwich.
Yeah.
And the addition of protein and fat changes the glycemic index
Lessons.
of the bolus, of the
Uh-huh.
meal.
Oh, interesting.
But still, I think it's worth knowing because it just goes to show you that starch is pure sugar at the end of the day.
Mhm.
It's not a simple carbohydrate. It is a complex carbohydrate, which only means that instead of being glucose molecules that are pre-separated from other glucose molecules,
Mhm.
they exist in as a chain of glucose molecules called a polysaccharide. But once you start to chew the bread, enzymes in your saliva called, one in particular called amylase, begins to break down the starch and separate those sugar molecules. So functionally, bread is like sugar. But as I
Oh,
mentioned, there are
interesting.
breads that are better from the standpoint of uh, that's some of their starch is less bioavailable. So as I mentioned, there was that study that found that sourdough bread led
Mhm.
to less of a glycemic excursion, which was interesting in that study because the carbohydrate quantity was controlled for with other commercial breads.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So, who would you recommend if you want to recommend someone to take 30 days brain bread free?
I mean, honestly,
Brain.
brain free. I think that it's worth, I mean, this might be controversial, but I think it's worth everybody trying for 30
Really?
days. Yeah, to see what it's like to free themselves of the constraint of the sandwich and this wheat culture where every meal and every snack is wheat based, and to
Yeah.
see how you feel after doing 30 days of a wheat free, gluten free diet.
Okay.
Yeah. um
Interesting. Even
and that includes like pasta and all that other stuff as well,
okay, so I was
obviously.
going to ask about that cuz I think bread and carbs, people think like you're not talking about going carb free
No, no,
for
no.
30 days. You're
Right.
talking about just bread,
Correct.
wheat.
Correct. Yeah, the same
Grains.
way that I would say it could be worthwhile to challenge yourself to do a no or minimal added sugar diet for 30
Okay.
days.
Thought you were going to say coffee and I was about to be like we're over that.
Well, I think it's important to audit your diet every once in a
Yeah,
while and to say, because all of these, especially with added sugar is insidious in the modern food supply, in the
totally.
modern diet, right? Like it's just everywhere. It's in sauces, it's in breads, it's in beverages. It's just, I mean, it's in dry rubs on ribs
Yeah.
or on meats and
Always
things like
comes
that,
back to
barbecue.
barbecue.
Yeah, it's just everywhere. And I think today, we eat a lot of wheat. We eat a lot of gluten. We eat
Yep.
snacks. We eat breaded meats. We eat sandwiches with every meal, pasta. So I think it could be worthwhile to see how you feel.
Okay.
We were talking before we got rolling about, a lot of people when they, they'll cut bread out of their diets
Yep.
for 30 days, and then they'll bring it back and they'll notice that they feel worse than they did before cutting it out,
Right.
right?
Yeah, like they were eating bread and kind of felt fine, but then were inspired to cut it out for 30, 60 days,
And then they bring it back and they feel
and
worse.
they feel like
Yeah.
crap. Excuse my
Well,
language.
because that's what they're doing is they're doing essentially a type of elimination diet where they're
Yeah,
cutting out the gluten and they bring it back and they realize that they might have just been used to the way that bread made them feel prior
totally.
to cutting it out. So
Because there's no way for you to cut something out of your diet, bring it back in, and then your body not be able to metabolize it. Like
no,
that ability.
you don't lose the ability to digest wheat or meat or any of those foods that
Okay.
people sometimes take out and they bring back and they
Yeah.
wonder whether or not their body has forgotten how to process it.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen because you have built into your genome how to produce the enzymes required to break down bread, meat,
Okay.
starch, stuff
Because
like that.
I have, just hear these people going on these wild elimination diets or, trying vegan for 2 months
Yeah.
and then they bring, I don't know, and then
No.
they're all effed up at the end.
Yeah.
And
I think people should just try it. I mean, bread's not the boogeyman, that
no.
I think some make it out to be, but it is for the most part. empty calories for
Yeah.
most people, especially when we're talking about commercial breads and all the wheat snacks and things like that. I mean, it ends up being a lot of junk food that people are
Totally.
consuming.
Well, and
So
it goes back to the processed aspect of like things. Like I feel like we always circle back to, is it processed? And bread is.
absolutely. And refined grains are a major problem. Like the consumption of refined grains is associated with worse cardiovascular health, worse metabolic health, a bigger waistline,
Yep.
worse brain health. And sitting at the center of
Mhm.
processed grain consumption in the standard American diet is bread.
Yeah.
And so we need to, I think, all become a little bit more mindful
Yeah.
of that.
Yeah.
So
Interesting.
another thing that I think is really important that most people don't realize is that bread, this might be shocking to some listeners or some viewers, that bread is the number one source of dietary sodium in the standard American diet.
That's wild.
Isn't that wild? It's
Yeah.
not processed meats. It's not canned foods. It's bread and rolls. Bread. Now, this could be due to baking soda, which is very high in sodium. It could be due to added salt. Who knows? But that
Okay.
all that is to say, it's the number one source of dietary sodium.
Great.
And people who consume the standard American diet, they're eating a lot of salt,
Mhm.
a lot of salt. And not, one thing I like to remind people of is that the salt that most people are consuming isn't coming from their salt shakers. It's not coming from the salt that they add to their vegetables when they're cooking a delicious and healthy and nourishing home cooked meal. It comes from ultra processed foods.
Yep.
And bread, hello, it is a very commonly consumed ultra processed food, in its most common iteration, and it's the number one source of dietary sodium. Now, this isn't going to be a problem for all people, but there is a population who are called sodium sensitive hypertensives.
Mhm.
And what that basically means is that on a high sodium diet, you'll see your blood pressure increase by 5% or more. Yeah. And that people actually with hypertension, a higher proportion of them actually are going to be sodium sensitive hypertensive. And so it's very important to just kind of know where your salt is coming from.
Yeah. Because
Right?
no, that's huge. Like
Most dietitians will say, if you are sodium sensitive hypertensive, you go to most dietitians, they'll say, stop put the salt shaker down,
Yeah.
stop salting your food. But they won't say anything like, okay, cut the bread
Yeah.
and cut the rolls and the breads and the sandwiches out of your diet. No, right?
Yeah, which then makes someone feel like they've done it to themselves. When in reality, it's the food environment and what's in the
Exactly.
grocery store.
Well said.
Which,
Yep.
yucky.
1,000%.
Because wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, definitely lots to be
With
mindful of. Now, going back to cutting bread out for 30 days.
Yeah, I was just going to circle back on that.
If you're not sodium sensitive, if you're very active, and so the fact that most wheat is just essentially sugar is of no consequence to you, right? Because you're very active,
Mhm.
and you're not gluten sensitive,
Mhm.
what else could go wrong with the chronic consumption of bread?
I don't know.
It's not good for your dental health. Yeah.
Okay.
So refined grains, definitely at the cornerstone of the epidemic of dental caries, aka cavities, that we see in the Western world. And the fact that commercial breads usually are made with added sugar increases the probability that the starches are going to be taken up by the bacteria that live on and around your teeth and in your gum line, to form a biofilm that are then going to excrete acids that cause the demineralization of teeth.
Yeah.
And teeth are super important. I think I think the foods, I have another theory, and that is
Okay.
that the foods that are best for your oral health are going to be the best for systemic health.
Okay.
And I think there's no question that refined grains are not good from a dental health standpoint.
Yeah.
Certainly not added sugar.
Yeah.
But commercial breads, terrible from the standpoint of dental health. And what's good for the oral environment is going to be good for the systemic environment. What's bad for the oral environment, it's going to be bad for the systemic environment.
Interesting.
It's because nature doesn't like make mistakes where something would be good for the body and bad for the teeth, right?
Right.
Like,
makes total sense.
Yeah, that's just not how evolution works. So, I mean, you could almost look at anything through the lens of, is this going to be good for my teeth? I'll tell you, and this is end of one anecdote. So,
Okay.
this is just me, but um, I grew up eating a predominantly grain-based diet. I ate a lot of bread and rolls growing up, and I always had cavities. I wasn't even a big candy eater. I mean, I ate, I think, the average amount of candy
Yeah.
that a kid eats, but I wasn't like obsessed with candy. And my parents weren't the kinds of parents that would regularly buy me candy. But I ate a lot of like wheat products,
Mhm.
and I had a ton of cavities growing up. Just like every time I would go to the dentist, I would have another cavity.
Hmm.
And you don't really,
I don't have any
yeah, you don't
cavities.
have any. It's amazing. It's amazing. But
Yeah.
I did growing up. I had a ton of cavities, and ever since I changed my diet and I cut bread out, and pasta and most other
Yeah.
sources of refined grains, no new cavities.
Oh, interesting. I mean,
Zero.
I could see that. The mouth is incredible. There was like a whole kind of movement of like putting the mouth back in medicine. Because you go to the primary care physician, they don't check your mouth.
Yeah.
Um, but they definitely can because they're not checking your teeth, but your mouth. It's
Hmm.
just so very interesting. Wow. Yeah, I
Super.
kind of think that theory is most
Holds
of your
water.
theories work, but that one I'll give it to you.
Some don't, but yeah,
True.
I think, well, because the thing is, from the standpoint of like, just think about just think about like basic biology and evolution, and an animal without teeth, right? Like teeth for an animal, it's how you find food, it's how you
Yep.
eat food, and it's also how you fight off predators,
Yeah.
right? So an animal without teeth in the wild is quickly a dead animal. And so again, anything that is going to be bad for your teeth over the long run. And don't forget, animals also, like, they don't brush their teeth. They're not being
No.
sold by the American Dental Association this idea that you've got to floss and brush your teeth
Correct.
multiple times a day for good dental health, right?
Yes.
Um, they just eat.
Yep.
And so they generally, an animal being fed its biologically appropriate diet isn't going to see the kind of dental decay
Mhm.
that you see in modern humans. The insidious nature of added sugar in the modern food
Yeah.
supply. It's everywhere. It's in sauces, it's in commercial breads,
Yeah.
it's in the things that obviously taste overtly sweet, but even things
Mhm.
that aren't necessarily sweet or indulgent
Yeah.
tend to have added sugar today. Roasted nuts, they add sugar. It's just like dried fruit. Fruit is nature's candy. Fruit is already sweet.
Yeah, I know.
I was at the supermarket the other day trying to find tart cherries, and it's impossible to find them without added
Without
sugar.
it.
Yeah.
Wow.
So,
Okay.
and it
So,
adds up. It adds up. And sugar
yeah.
has many different names. We already talked about agave syrup, but there's,
Yeah.
malt syrup, brown rice syrup, date syrup. I mean, usually if it's got syrup,
It's not good.
that's a red flag.
Red flag.
But
Okay. So, we've got agave fruit juices, sugar sweetened beverages. What else do we have on my avoid
on
list?
the avoid list, so
Our avoid list.
after sugary drinks, so we're moving on from the sugary drinks category, and now we're going to talk about fat. So grapeseed oil.
All right.
A lot of people are confused about grapeseed oil. It sounds healthy, right?
I think
It's
so.
made of, it's got grape
Grape
in the name,
it's got
grapes.
seed.
Who doesn't love grapes? And nuts and seeds are healthy. So
Yeah.
grapeseed oil, it's got to be good for you, right?
Uh-huh.
Grapeseed oil it actually, I was going to say it's trash, but it actually was trash. It was a throwaway product of the winemaking industry. The seeds of grapes, they would throw them away.
Wow.
And then one industrious entrepreneur realized that you can squeeze them for a little bit of oil, and you can process them intensely
Okay.
to get rid of the bitter, noxious aromas and tastes that would ensue, and you could sell it basically as a high smoke point cooking oil. And so now you'll find grapeseed oil in salad dressings. You'll find it in commercial bread products. I mean, it's completely ubiquitous in the food in
Yeah.
the modern food supply, along with soybean oil, corn oil, and canola oil. Other oils worth avoiding. Um, and the problem with grapeseed oil is that, like the other grain and seed oils that I just mentioned, it's very delicate and damage prone, and it's used in any number of ultra processed foods. So not only is consuming it like a proxy for ultra processed food consumption, but these oils they're damage prone, and it's the high heat cooking, it's the sitting out in the warm kitchen environment for months on end, it's the processes that are involved, the cooking that's involved in the creation of these packaged processed foods that
Mhm.
damages the oil. And so there's that works against it, but then also the fact that it has a very skewed omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. It's got about 700 parts of omega-6 fatty acids for every 1 part omega-3. So the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio in grapeseed oil is 700 to 1.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Now,
So
yeah, which we think that we want to consume a ratio of omega-6s to omega-3s, 1 to 1, maybe 2 to 1, maybe 4 to 1.
okay.
We think that that's what our ancestral diet, the that omega-6 to omega-3 ratio looked like, because there are potential metabolic consequences to having an omega-6 to ingesting omega-6s at a ratio so skewed,
Okay.
so much larger. Uh,
Then the omega-3.
yeah,
Okay. What's an example of a good ratio? Like a food that's got a good ratio? Like does
any whole food,
any whole food?
for the most
So it
part.
goes back to the processed aspect of it
Yeah,
and being
I would say the one exception to that would be nuts. Nuts are very high. Some nuts can be very high in omega-6 fatty acids.
okay.
Um, and omega-6 fatty acids are not to be feared.
Right.
They're essential,
Mhm.
along with omega-3s. But it's the overconsumption of them and the underconsumption of omega-3s that we want to be sort of cognizant
Okay.
of.
Okay.
Yeah. So
So
nuts and seeds are great, but a hunter-gatherer probably wasn't eating all that many nuts and seeds because he had to
yeah.
forage for them and shell them himself, right? Today we just eat them out of the bag by the
Right.
handful. And some nuts have a lot more omega-6s than others. Like macadamia nut it's actually a very expensive nut, probably maybe for this reason actually. It's very high in monounsaturated fat, which is a very healthful fatty acid.
Okay.
It's not one of these damage prone kinds of fats, but nuts like walnuts, for example, will have a very high omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. It's still a significant source of a plant-based form of
Right.
omega-3s, but if you look at grass-fed beef, if you look at wild salmon,
Yeah.
they have, it's a much more um the
Balance.
ratio is much more balanced.
Okay. That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's wild how like 700 to 1, that's just not like a casual difference.
It's not a casual difference.
Yeah.
And if you're just consuming grapeseed oil once in a while, again, not a
Yeah.
big deal. But the thing is, most Americans are over consuming those kinds of fats every single day,
Yeah.
due to the preponderance of like soybean oil, all those fats. And so this is just like, another one of those oils, not necessarily better or worse, but just adding fuel to the fire.
Yeah. Wow. So we to switch out grapeseed oil, you'd go to our classic avocado oil, olive oil,
Yeah, I would
one of those.
say I would say avocado oil is a great choice,
Okay.
especially if you're looking for an oil that is has no flavor. It's a very
Yeah.
mild oil.
Mhm.
Extra virgin olive oil, we love it. We use it all the time,
Yeah.
but it has a very,
A
noticeable,
delicious taste. But yeah,
delicious
it's
taste. But it's, maybe not appropriate in all recipes.
okay. All right.
Um,
What else you got for me?
so next on the list, related, fried food. Yeah, I was actually having this conversation the other day with my family. We were sitting in a restaurant and we had ordered an appetizer that we didn't know. It didn't say anything about the food being fried, right?
Okay.
So we ordered an appetizer that sounded good, and it comes to the table and it's like fried chicken. It's like this fried chicken dish, right?
Okay.
And my dad doesn't care, so
Yeah.
he went for it. But he asked me like because I didn't touch it, I didn't even taste it, and it's because I think that eating fried food is really really damaging from a health standpoint.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that when you fry food, so in the fryers is where they use these kinds of oils, right?
Mhm.
The grapeseed oil, usually it's going to be soybean oil, maybe peanut oil
Yeah.
in a higher end restaurant, primarily soybean oil. It's like the cheapest
Okay.
possible oil that a restaurant
And
can.
that's because it does well at a temp like, does like, the smoke point? Is that why, or is it cheap?
They have high smoke points, but it's
Yeah.
primarily, restaurants have notoriously thin margins. And so
Yeah.
they're looking to cut costs wherever they can. And soybean oil is a very cheap oil.
Okay.
Um, and they also don't change the oil out very
Right.
regularly. We talked about this in a previous
I think
solo
we
episode.
did. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's like you expect them to change it out between every
Yes.
meal. They're certainly not doing that. They're changing it maybe every couple of days.
Yeah.
And the oil becomes so toxic due to that heating and reheating
Yeah.
that they can't even dispose of it like normal trash. They have to put it in a separate container and it's got to be picked up. There's a scene I was watching this new movie called The Mosquito Coast, with Justin Theroux on Apple TV. And there's a scene where he's going to collect this, like the oil that's been
Yeah.
disposed from restaurants. He goes around to like all the different restaurants in his region collecting this oil, and he transforms it into biofuel essentially. But it becomes toxic.
Interesting.
And so those oils, they might, if you were to squeeze or press soybeans, even if you were to buy soybean oil like straight from the source,
Okay.
it wouldn't be. It's what happens when you take those oils and then you subject them to high heat for a prolonged period of time. They become toxic, and they generate all these different they oxidize. They generate all these different oxidative byproducts like certain aldehydes, which are very damaging to your mitochondria. They're mutagenic. They can cause, they're implicated in
Yeah.
cancer, and they certain of those aldehydes are carcinogenic. They're known carcinogens. Many of those chemicals are actually in part responsible for the delicious flavors that we associate with fried foods.
Yeah.
But they're really not good. So it's the frying. It's the fact that these oils are so damaging.
Yeah.
They're damaging because they're so damaged that
Yeah.
you really want to avoid fried foods at all costs. Unless you're frying the foods yourself, like
Yeah.
in your home with an oil that is like
Yeah.
fresh and hasn't been used for like 1,000 other dishes
Yeah.
prior to yours.
I know. I'm trying to think. When's the last time you've had a fried food? Do you know?
I can't even remember.
Did your dad enjoy it?
Yeah, he
The
liked
fried
it.
chicken?
Apparently, it was very tasty. Yes.
That was very tasty.
Yeah. Yeah. You just want to avoid. You want to avoid.
Yeah.
I mean, it's this is not. Shouldn't be revelatory that fried foods are are almost like they characterize so well the standard American diet, like a preponderance of fried foods, right? But they're uniquely, I think, damaging
I know.
because they harbor such, they harbor these unhealthy oils that have just been so
They've been
deranged,
through it.
chemically deranged. Yeah, they've been through
They've
it.
been through it. They've had a hard go.
Yeah.
And like, we need to let them go in peace.
Yeah.
And not eat them.
So avoid them.
Okay. So
Fried foods.
Avoiding. Occasionally love a French fry, but overall fried foods.
A little bit here and there won't kill you again, but
Also, baked French fries are really great. I don't know if you've ever made them, but
baked French fries?
Yeah.
I'm sure they're good.
They're good in the oven. They're delicious. They can get really crispy too.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's a Sid fact that you guys didn't ask for.
I'm into that.
All right. What else am I avoiding?
So up next we have fast food and packaged food.
Okay.
So, obviously you're going to find a lot of fried food in fast food, but even foods in fast food that are not necessarily fried, can harbor endocrine disrupting compounds. There was this big expose recently where researchers went to a bunch of different fast food restaurants, like well-known, popular fast food restaurants. I forget we probably shouldn't even mention brands, but, ubiquitous fast food chains, and got very popular dishes off the menu, and they tested them for levels of phthalates. Phthalates are compounds they're basically plasticizing compounds. You'll find them in any number of like soft plastic products.
Okay.
And phthalates, what's so dangerous about phthalates, as well as bisphenol A and other plasticizing compounds, is that they're endocrine disruptors. So they disrupt the system of hormones in your body that influence everything from brain development to sexual function and performance, to hunger and satiety signals in the body, to fat storage, to mental health, well-being. And these compounds in particular have been known for decades at this point to act as xenoestrogens in the body. So they act like the hormone estrogen. They can prevent natural estrogen from doing its job. They can also interfere with how testosterone functions. Um, so they're really not good. And what they found was that these foods in these fast food restaurants
Mhm.
harbored very high levels of phthalates. And it actually shouldn't be surprising because when you think about processed foods, just think about the production mechanisms by which, like, even a burger, like a fast food burger is made. Think about, like, all of the soft plastic tubing that the meat has to like flow through
Yeah.
before it ends up shaped, in the shape of a patty on your
So
bun in your mouth.
that's what how does it get there to begin with? Is it the way it's processed and transported and all of that? Like, how does
Yeah,
the
the way that it's processed, the way that it's stored, transported. Yeah, I mean, you
okay.
you said it. Um, Milkshakes flowing through any if what I recommend to people is to think about the food that's in their hands and to try to envision how it ended up there.
Yeah.
Is it the kind of food that had to flow through myriad networks of soft plastic tubing? And was it something that had to be stored in vats that probably have some kind of like anti-corrosive coating in those vats?
Yeah.
Um,
Gnarly.
yeah, it's very likely to harbor endocrine disrupting
Right.
compounds. Even sparkling water. There was an expose um, that found that certain brands of sparkling water had very high levels of PFAS
I
substances.
think that was I shouldn't mention brands, but the Topo Chico one in the glass bottle.
Yeah,
I saw that
they
maybe
had very high
Sweet Babe did
levels.
something on that.
They had very high levels of PFAS. So per and polyfluoral alkylated substances are um, the category of substances that include Teflon.
Yeah.
So they're used to create nonstick coatings
Yeah.
on pans and stuff like that. Um, Very powerful endocrine disruptors. Don't uh, degrade. We call them forever chemicals because they don't biodegrade.
Just hang out.
They're persistent environmental toxins,
Okay.
and they are ubiquitous at this point. I mean, in the
Yeah.
modern food environment certainly, but in the environment at large as well.
What you said was interesting about like thinking about where your food came from, and like I always think like, oh, this came from hopefully a healthy cow or like a good farm with good soil, but then like you really need to think about where how did it get there?
Yeah,
And how long has it been in its plastic tube?
yeah.
Um
If it's for dried food that's stored in plastic, I don't worry about.
okay.
It's usually fatty foods, wet foods, hot foods, salty foods. These are the foods that are the most likely to leach these compounds.
Mhm.
You definitely don't want to heat your food in plastic. You don't want
Right.
to store wet foods in plastic. Like, what do we use? We use Pyrex
Mhm.
containers, right?
Love a good Pyrex, love good glass.
When we cook, yeah, we meal prep, we store in glass.
Yeah.
It's super important.
Yeah.
And today what we're going to talk about are the top 10 foods that you can use to potentially help prevent dementia. I became obsessed with this topic when about 8 years ago my own mother started to show the very earliest symptoms of a very rare form of dementia, and it sent me down the rabbit hole. I became obsessed with trying to understand to the best of my ability the kinds of foods and lifestyle modifications that I might be able to integrate into my life to help minimize my risk of ever developing any kind of dementia. So what I did was I stumbled upon 10 foods that essentially give your brain not only the building blocks that it requires to create healthy new brain cells for the entirety of your life, but also give your brain the tools that it can use to fend off against everyday stresses that can accelerate aging and potentially instigate or exacerbate neurological conditions, one of which being Alzheimer's disease. Dementia is a category of memory disorders that include Alzheimer's disease, which is the most common of them and is also the most common neurodegenerative condition. But then there are other types of dementia like Parkinson's disease dementia, vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia. So it's an umbrella term, but at the end of the day, all dementias are memory disorders, and they affect people at all different ages, although mostly you'll find dementia striking at the older end of the age spectrum. Generally speaking, Alzheimer's disease, which is the most common form of dementia, affects your working memory, it affects your processing speed, and it affects your executive function, which include your ability to focus, to pay attention, to tune out distractions. And every case of dementia is different. Once you've seen one case of dementia, you've seen one case of dementia. Alzheimer's disease does not have a cure, and the treatments that are available are minimally effective. I mean, one shocking thing about Alzheimer's disease is that drug trials to find viable treatments for the condition have a 99.6% failure rate. And so that's why I firmly believe that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Many people around the world have dementia. In the United States alone, about 5 million people are estimated to have Alzheimer's disease, and that number is expected to explode by the year 2050 when about 15 million people are projected to have Alzheimer's disease. 1 in 3 people today over the age of 85 have Alzheimer's disease, and in the future, if you make it to the age of 85, your risk might go up to 1 in 2. It's something that begins in the brain far earlier than the presentation of symptoms, and that's why I really think that you're never too young, or too old for that matter, to begin thinking about prevention. If you exercise regularly, if you get good quality sleep every night, if you find a way of managing your stress, you then have a pretty good shot according to the best available evidence. There are even some foods that we can eat that can help protect your brain as it ages. So these are all the foods that I've uncovered in my research that give the brain what it needs, what it requires, what it yearns for. Over here, we can start with almonds. Now, really all nuts are healthy, but almonds in particular I've highlighted because they are a top source of dietary magnesium. Almonds also are a very rich source of vitamin E. There is a good relationship between vitamin E consumption and lower risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. When you eat almonds, you want to make sure that they are either raw or dry roasted. Raw almonds are what's up. Here we have blueberries. Blueberries are tremendous. They are rich in anthocyanins, which gives them their beautiful blue color, and anthocyanins can also be found in blue corn, purple potatoes, and red onions. But these compounds have been validated in human observational studies to help protect the brain as it ages. Everybody tends to rejoice when I mention dark chocolate. Dark chocolate, it's a sweet treat, but it also packs a powerful health wallop, and that is because dark chocolate, again, is a very good source of dietary magnesium, and it also is full of what are called cocoflavanols, which have been shown to benefit cardiovascular health. What you really want to make sure to do is to buy dark chocolate, 85% or higher. Over here we have broccoli. So I'm a big fan of cruciferous vegetables. Cruciferous vegetables are important for a number of reasons, but for one, they give your body the compounds that it requires to create its own endogenous, meaning created in the body, antioxidant and detoxification compounds. The other thing that cruciferous vegetables do is, aside from giving your body the ingredients that it requires to create those detox compounds, is it stimulates them. It actually contains chemicals that stimulate your body's own detoxification machinery. Up next, we have avocado. Avocado is an all-in-one brain food, and the reason for that is that it contains the highest concentration of fat-protecting antioxidants of any fruit or vegetable. And they're packed with carotenoids, which are essentially plant pigments. The two that are found in avocados are lutein and zeaxanthin, which have been shown actually in a University of Georgia study to help boost processing speed in the brain in young and healthy people by 20%. So that's actually quite astonishing because young and healthy people are already thought to be at the peak of their cognitive prowess. So if you eat more avocados, you might in turn develop a faster performing brain. Up next, we've got wild salmon. So wild salmon provides omega-3 fatty acids that are already in their plug-and-play format. So when you eat a piece of wild salmon, they get sucked up into the brain, and your brain uses those compounds to basically create healthy new brain cells. And there also seems to be a protective effect for people that consume fatty fish like salmon regularly. It seems to play a role in the mitigation of risk for Alzheimer's disease when part of a Mediterranean dietary pattern. Now, grass-fed beef is one of my more controversial recommendations, but I'm a big fan of grass-fed beef for a number of reasons. Not only is it the most bioavailable source of iron, but it provides a non-trivial source of omega-3 fatty acids, which again, the brain requires for good health. And it also contains a compound called creatine, which is very important for energy production in the brain. It's also a very good source of vitamin E. In fact, grass-fed beef has 3 times the vitamin E of grain-fed beef. When shopping for red meat, you really want to opt for grass-fed. Not only is it the kinder option in terms of the animal, it's definitely the more sustainable option for the planet as well. Moving on, we've got eggs. So an egg yolk literally is designed by nature to contain everything required to grow a healthy brain. In fact, it's no wonder that many people refer to egg yolks as nature's multivitamin. Now, I'm a big fan of dark leafy greens in general, but here we have kale. You can substitute kale for spinach, for arugula, but research out of Rush University has found that people who eat a large bowl of dark leafy greens every single day have brains that tend to look younger by up to 11 years on cognitive tests and scans. Last but not least, we've got extra virgin olive oil. Now, extra virgin olive oil is a staple of the Mediterranean dietary pattern, adherence to which is associated with a robust risk reduction for Alzheimer's disease by up to 65%, according to Rush University research. Now, many chronic diseases today are characterized in part by having excessive chronic low-grade inflammation. And extra virgin olive oil has a compound in it that's been shown to be as anti-inflammatory as low-dose ibuprofen. So if you're a vegan or vegetarian, I mean, one of the most obvious things that you should be doing is supplementing with vitamin B12, which is the only essential nutrient that is found exclusively in animal products. But aside from vitamin B12, generally I would say probably the strongest evidence is in favor of supplementing with algal DHA from algae, which is a replacement for the preformed EPA and DHA fat that you'll find in wild salmon or grass-fed beef or even omega-3 enriched eggs, for example. Look to prioritizing choline in your diet, which is found in a number of different vegetables. You just have to eat a lot of them to get your adequate intake for choline. And I would also probably consider supplementing with a little bit of creatine. Those are the ways that I would probably try to compensate if I were vegan or vegetarian myself. So Alzheimer's disease prevention obviously is more than just eating an almond or a blueberry here and there. It's about really embracing the lifestyle, and that is optimizing your sleep, exercising more, and eating foods like what I have here in front of me. You know, again, we're just at the very tip of the iceberg in terms of understanding what causes Alzheimer's disease for each person. What we might find in the future, and what I expect to be the case, is that there might be a different cause of Alzheimer's disease for each individual patient. We each have different genes, different genders, different fitness levels, different ages. And I think that, you know, as we go forward into this amazing and important line of inquiry, we're gonna find answers to some of these questions. So I'm very excited. And if you'd like to support that process, more than just eating these foods, which I hope you do, click the link below to support the Alzheimer's Prevention Clinic and Alzheimer's Universe. And if you'd like to go even deeper with more actionable tips that you can use to optimize the way that your brain works today and decades into the future, don't forget to pick up my New York Times best-selling book, Genius Foods, which is available everywhere books are sold. I'm Max Lugavere for Goodful. Protect your brain, it's worth it.
I've definitely done a PubMed search of propolis. There's a good amount of there's like, you know, there have been clinical trials, there have been like research reviews. People are definitely within the scientific community talking about this substance, but it's probably just not nearly as well funded as a pharmaceutical agent. And so you're not going to see the kinds of robust, you know, multi-center trials that you're going to see with a drug candidate. But
Totally.
that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not doing something.
For a natural substance that doesn't have, you know, big pharma money funding studies, it actually is a remarkable amount of research. It was really interesting. During COVID, we saw a huge spike in interest just for propolis because a lot of doctors that have a presence online, a lot of, you know, health professionals were talking about propolis as an ingredient to support and protect your immune system. So more and more people are starting to understand propolis and search for it and look for it and understand what it is as an ingredient, but we're still really in the early days of sharing it in North America.
It's great. Well, Europe is so ahead of the curve in so many ways that it's so great that you were able to find it and now make it available to everybody in the way that you have. So we've talked about honey, we've talked about propolis. Royal jelly is something that I first heard about when I was a kid, like years ago. And I've never known what it does or, you know, why people like to use it, or I don't even know. Yeah. What is it? What's royal jelly?
So royal jelly. So again, honey is the bee's food. Propolis is the bee's medicine. Royal jelly, you can kind of think of as the brain food of the hive. So royal jelly, the nurse bees make it. And, you know, a lot of people compare it to like colostrum. So for all newborn baby bees, for the first 3 days of development, they're given royal jelly. It's like breast milk.
Wow.
And then after 3 days, the bees transition off of royal jelly onto a more normal diet, bee diet of honey and pollen. And only the bee who's to become queen continues with her exclusive royal jelly diet. So that is all the queen is eating.
Is that why it's called royal jelly?
Yeah, it's the queen's food.
It's like bee breast milk.
Yeah.
That bees
Royal
don't-
jelly has more of a ring, you know.
I was going to ask a really stupid question to be funny, but I'm not going to go there. So royal jelly.
Yeah. So
Tell me
royal
about
jelly.
its properties.
So it's the exclusive food of the queen bee. Really interesting because if you just look at the queen bee on a biological level, the queen bee she evolves very differently than regular bees. And, you know, I think her royal jelly diet plays a big part in that. So the queen bee is much more robust. If you just Google queen bee versus like regular worker bee, she's jacked, like she's fit.
Wow.
The queen bee will lay around 1,500 babies a day, whereas regular female worker bees don't have reproductive organs. The queen bee will live 3 to 5 years, whereas a regular worker bee during foraging season lives 6 to 8 weeks. They literally work their ass off until they die.
Worker bees don't reproduce.
No, they don't. It's
The queen bee
who
makes
does
them
it
all.
all.
Wow,
Yep.
that is fascinating. And
Mhm.
also what I've learned is that worker bees are primarily, they're all for the most part
women.
female.
All women. The women do everything in the hive.
See, bees also, they have this beautiful women's empowerment story to them as well, because they're doing so many good things for the world, and they're mostly women.
Yeah. The male bees, they're called drones.
Women. I could probably get in trouble for that. Not that I care, but we'll say that they're female.
Yeah.
More,
But
more
the
accurate.
male bees are called drones, and their sole purpose in life is reproduction. Like they basically mate with the queen. They die during this process. The queen will take her like mating flight, have sex in the air with a drone, and he dies.
Oh, man.
Yeah. Goes out good, goes out strong. And then once the queen has once she's pregnant and when it's sort of like approaching fall, the male bees are all kicked out of the hive. The girls are like, hey, you guys are a drain on resources. You're going to need to go. And they just, overwinter like that. So the male bees don't do much.
I had no idea that bees were such feminists.
They are.
I love it. I love it. Hey,
Yeah.
Sometimes I see huge bees flying around.
Mhm.
Are those
Those are bumblebees.
Those are
probably.
So there's a difference between the worker bees, between a worker bee and a bumblebee?
So there's a bunch of different bee species. So honeybees are the ones that we work with at Beekeepers Naturals. Honeybees are the ones that are making the honey. They're the most effective pollinator, but there are tons of different bee species that are great pollinators too. So the big fuzzy ones, those are bumblebees.
Yeah, they're slow and cumbersome, and
They're really cute.
they terrify
cute.
me. They terrify me. Glad you find them cute. So those are bumblebees.
Those are bumblebees. Yeah. So yeah, there's a bunch of different types of bees. Bumblebees are, so generally speaking, like solitary bees, bumblebees are actually social as well, but solitary bees, there's some bee species that really live on their own. They don't live in like a hive community, and they're really unlikely to sting you. There are even stingless bees. Like there's tons of different types of bees all over the world. So yeah, honeybees though, they are the world's most effective pollinators. So they're, again, all bees are super amazing at pollination, but honeybees are just like efficient.
Wow. So we've talked about propolis.
Mhm.
We've talked about honey.
I should tell you what royal jelly does for humans though, because it's amazing for bees, but it has some really cool properties that affect humans and specifically affect the brain.
Interesting.
Mhm.
Yeah, you mentioned that it was like a brain food. So what does it do to the human?
Yeah.
Brain.
So royal jelly is really well known for focus, memory, concentration. It contains acetylcholine. It's one of the only naturally occurring sources. So acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter basically responsible for brain-body connection. It helps to speed up your transmission system. And then this is like a really cool thing that I like to nerd out on. Royal jelly contains these two fatty acids called 10-HDA and AMP-N1 oxide. And these basically promote BDNF. They act as a catalyst for neurogenesis. So they're really, I see a lot of people using royal jelly after a concussion, or, with any sort of brain trauma. I use royal jelly on a daily basis. We have these like Be Smart brain shots that I think you've tried. I take those every day, and that's just what I do for focus, memory, concentration. I also try to stay off caffeine, and royal jelly gives you like a nice little energy boost. But royal jelly is really powerful for pretty much supporting your executive functioning.
Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, the bee elixir like capsules that you guys make.
Mhm.
Very interesting. I know there's a lot of people interested in nootropic. Would you consider it a nootropic substance?
Absolutely. Yeah. Our Be Smart shots are definitely nootropics. And so we have the royal jelly in there. And then we have ginkgo biloba, which I'm sure a lot of your listeners know about. And then Bacopa monnieri, it's also an adaptogen. It's an extract from a leaf traditionally used in Ayurvedic medicine that has great properties for the brain as well.
Amazing. So bee pollen, where does bee pollen fit into all
Yeah,
this?
pollen is also one of my favorites. And I'm really sorry because I brought you bee pollen and left it in my Uber, but I'm going to get you more.
Bee pollen is actually like my of all of them, I would say probably my favorite. I eat this stuff by the fistful.
I mean, it's so good for you.
Well before even you got started with Beekeepers Naturals, I was a huge fan of it. It's so good. How would you describe the taste? It's like fruity.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the time of year it's harvested and the floral sources. I'm like so good with my bee pollen now that I kind of know what flowers it's coming from. Not always, but sometimes. But bee pollen, you can really think of it. So for the bees, carrying on with our theme here, for the bees, it's their protein source.
Hmm.
So literally the bees will go flower to flower, collect the pollen, they mix it with their enzymes, so they kind of like bunch it up, and then they stick it on their hind legs, and it's called their pollen pants. So like if you see a picture of a bee with these like yellow balls on their hind legs, that's their pollen pants, and they're carrying it back to the hive like that.
Wow.
Yeah, and then it's the bee's protein. So that's what bee pollen is. It's literally the protein source for the bees. The bees eat it. And for humans, I like to think of bee pollen as nature's multivitamin. It is just one of the most nourishing substances. It's full of broad spectrum vitamins, minerals. It's actually got more protein per weight than any animal source. That's per weight. So it's
Hmm.
not that heavy, but it's a really complete food. And so it's something that I take every single day. And I do it for energy boosting, but I really just do it to cover my bases nutritionally because it's so bioavailable and it's just such a potent source of vitamins and minerals.
And it's an actual food. I mean, it's not
Yeah.
a supplement. Next to
Mhm.
honey, it's like the other food that is produced by bees. How do you integrate
Absolutely.
bee pollen into your diet? Do you
I
do
put
you do
it
it like me? Like you just shovel it into your mouth or
So after I work out, it depends what I've done actually. If I'm going to do something that's really intense cardio, I'll take it before because it actually increases your endurance. I'll just like have a spoon of it or like throw back a pollen shot. I sometimes take it after I work out just for recovery. But I'll put it on my smoothie. I put bee pollen on like everything. I sprinkle it on my avocado toast. Anything that you would put like chia seeds or hemp seeds or cacao nibs, anything like that on, I use bee pollen. I even put it on ice cream. I'll like make an ice cream sundae and sprinkle bee pollen on top of it.
that sounds fire. I mean, I put it on the ice creams that I make in my Vitamix. Like I'll just like
Hmm.
blend up some frozen berries and whey protein, which by the way, for any of you guys listening, you can make a really simple ice cream doing this. You just get frozen berries. I like to get a mixed bag of organic berries from like Sprouts or whatever. And you throw like a little bit of almond milk unsweetened and then 2 scoops of protein powder. You blend it up and you mash it down with a tamper and you get this ice cream. And then after that, I love to sprinkle some bee pollen on top. It's so good.
That sounds really good.
Yeah, it's tasty.
That's the thing though that I love about all bee products, from propolis to pollen to you name it. They're like food grade, they're very bioavailable because I have such an issue with, not all supplements are taken in by the body the way we want them to be. A lot of things we just don't really break down and we titrate and pee out, the $40 supplement we're spending money on. And so bee products, they're really well integrated by your system.
Couldn't agree more. Sometimes I get bee pollen that's really soft, and then other
Mhm.
times I get it and it's really firm. Is there a difference in the chemical constituents that account for that variation?
So there's a few things that could be making a difference. One is the floral type it's coming from. There's just, natural variance in the type of pollen. But the other thing is a lot of pollen, and all pollen's great. So, just take your pollen, everyone. But unless you have very severe allergies, in that case, I would be careful because it's pollen from the plant. So,
Right.
you know, um, a lot of pollen is dried.
Hmm.
So people will harvest it, they'll apply a lot of heat, they'll dry it out, and then they sell it, and it can be a little bit crunchier. So something that we do is all of our pollen's raw, and even dried pollen is incredibly nutritionally dense. But I like to keep ours raw because pollen has, like all bee products, really powerful enzymes. Like how the bee is collecting the pollen and how they're bunching it together and transferring it, otherwise it would be a powder, is by mixing it with their enzymes. And bee enzymes are magic. So for the Pollen at Beekeepers Naturals, it's completely raw. And that's why we recommend, like, once you open it, it's totally fine before you open it. And if you've opened it already, it's not bad. It's just ideal to keep in the fridge or freezer after you've opened it. Now, when I travel, like I did a road trip this summer, my pollen was sitting in a hot car and I ate it every day. It gets really hot in the hive, so it's not like your pollen's going to go bad, but it is great to preserve the enzymes that way. But sometimes the harder pollen, it's because they've applied a lot of heat and dried it out.
Interesting, but it doesn't degrade the health qualities of
I
it.
mean, it will degrade the enzymes for sure. Anytime you're applying a high heat like that, and like heat as in, so sometimes the reason people will apply heat to pollen sometimes is to clean it. For
Like,
us,
is that like pasteurization or?
sort of, you can think of it that way, just because little things like, sticks, leaves, when you harvest pollen, there's stuff that gets into it. Like how you harvest pollen is you put this basket kind of under an area of the hive, and the pollen that the bees basically drop, we collect and
Oh,
take
wow.
that. And so there's, people have different methods, but that's what we do. But with that, you get leaves, you'll get like twigs, that sort of thing. And so some people will use a really high heat to clean it. What we do is we use air. So we basically have this huge machine where we like fan it. And so we basically blow out, and it's sort of like a mesh catcher. We blow out anything that's bigger than the pollen granules.
That's so cool. It's definitely one of those things. Like I have to have it in my fridge, and on Greek yogurt, I'll put it in. It's even good on salads, like in salad dressing. It's got a really strong flavor,
Yeah.
so I don't use a lot in salads, but definitely people should check it out. It feels decadent too. I mean, I just like, yeah, I go to town on that
It's so
stuff.
funny. When I first started beekeeping, the first time I tried pollen, I was like, no, this is like way too earthy for me. I don't like this taste. And now my body craves it,
Yeah, I love
like
it.
all the time.
It's awesome. I want to go back to honey a little bit because it's obviously the most common of the products produced by bees, and there are a bunch of different kinds of honey on the market. So maybe you can help us make sense of all that, right? Like you mentioned, I think earlier, Manuka.
Yeah.
What are the different honey types, and what should people be looking for?
Yeah. So Manuka honey, it's a specific type of honey that comes from the Manuka plant. It's native to New Zealand. The Manuka plant's really similar to eucalyptus. So eucalyptus honey would have similar properties.
So Manuka honey doesn't come from a specific type of bee.
No, it's a specific type of plant.
Got it.
But Manuka got really famous because New Zealand ran studies on it. And they found that Manuka has antiviral capabilities. Now, Manuka is really expensive. And I think that our local honey would have those same antiviral capabilities, but we just haven't done the same studies. We know for sure that propolis is a stronger antiviral source than any honey. Like there's no honey that's going to be a lot of raw honeys have traces of propolis in them, and that's part of their magic. But propolis specifically, like that's really what you want for immune driven things. And it's going to be much more potent than honey. But as you said, there's a lot of different honey varietals. So when you're looking for honey, so Manuka is great, but do you need to spend a crazy amount of money for like the name Manuka? No, like any raw, good quality honey is going to get you there. Now, a study was done and it found that the darker the honey, the higher the antioxidants. So buckwheat honey, which is comes from the buckwheat plant. That one has a very earthy flavor. It's not like the sort of like light sweet honey, but it's also got a dark, rich color, kind of molasses looking. That has the highest antioxidants. And really interesting, there was a study that was looking at buckwheat honey compared to a substance called dextromethorphan. And dextro is it's the active ingredient in most cough syrup. So like Robitussin, whatever you would buy at CVS, the traditional cough syrup, typically has dextro in it. And the study was done comparing buckwheat honey to dextro, and it was looking specifically at upper pediatric respiratory infections, so kids with respiratory infections.
Wow.
And it found that buckwheat honey was just as effective.
Wow.
And so when that study came out, I was like, oh my gosh, why would you give a kid or adult dextro and like the sugar cough syrups when buckwheat honey is literally just as effective? So that's why we made our cough syrup.
Wow, that's amazing. So the darker the honey,
Yeah.
generally,
Darker,
the more
the more antioxidants. The key things to look for raw, because if you're buying pasteurized honey, and pasteurized honey just means it's been heated to a really high degree. It's like the type of honey that typically comes out of that squeezy bear is pasteurized. If it's really liquidy, it's probably been pasteurized unless it was like just harvested. And so you do not want that because that's sugar water. Pasteurized honey, you've cooked all the nutrients out. You've applied a really high heat. So, you're losing all those antioxidants and all the nutritional properties. So, the raw honey is what you want. So, always make sure you have that. Now, raw honey will solidify. So, sometimes I have people say, like, oh, my honey went bad. And I'm like, well, that's impossible because honey is the only food on the planet that never expires. Like, they've found honey in Egyptian tombs that's like totally nutritionally intact. And that's a testament to bees' enzymes. It's pretty
Wow.
cool. So, yeah, your honey, like, it never expires.
That's so
Not
interesting.
possible. Yeah. So if your honey's getting hard, it's just crystallizing, which is a natural process. And that's why people pasteurize honey to avoid crystallization because it's more user friendly, squeezes out of a tube. If it pasteurizes, it's harder. You have to kind of heat it up a little bit to soften it. So yeah, but crystallization is a totally natural process. If your honey crystallizes, that's fine. Still eat it. If you want it to be softer, what you can do is heat up some water, stick the jar of honey into the boiling water. You're not going to pasteurize it doing that. You have to work at it to pasteurize it. And that's how you can soften it. But the key thing is look for raw honey and do your best to look for a honey that's pesticide free and organic. What we were talking about earlier, organic does not necessarily mean pesticide free, unfortunately.
That's a big misconception that I
Yeah.
think needs to be dispelled. However, organic does indicate typically that there's there's no
Lower.
there's also they don't use legally they can't use synthetic pesticides,
Mhm.
but organic they still have organic approved pesticides.
Totally.
But I would feel a lot safer. I know that there's like people are listening and be like nature fallacy, like natural doesn't necessarily mean safer, but
Mhm.
when it comes to herbicides, pesticides, and things like that, they use like vitamin D as a natural pesticide, an organic approved pesticide.
Totally. So I wasn't even, first of all, organic is, definitely safer. And for me with my produce, I make a real concerted effort to purchase organic produce because I just don't want the synthetic pesticides, I just don't want to support that
Mhm.
generally. Um, but with bee products, even organic pesticides, it doesn't necessarily mean pesticide free. Because remember, the bees will forage for a 5 mile radius. So that's why, like
Interesting.
at beekeepers, our apiaries are in the middle of nowhere. We do a ton of work in Canada because it's a massive landmass with a tiny population. So like we have bees in the Rockies. Like our bees are really in the middle of nowhere. And there are definitely places in the US where you can get pesticide free and where or the organic pesticides aren't surrounded by like the gross pesticides, but it's getting harder and harder in the US.
Wow. What about the packaging? Does that matter? Because when you were talking about the plastic bear bottle with the honey, I was thinking, okay, they're pasteurizing this honey, they're heating it up, and then they're putting it probably straight afterwards into this plastic container that, hot liquid plastic container. To me, that's a recipe for exposure to plasticizing compounds.
Yeah, I mean, I'm big on anything that's super hot. I don't want it near plastic. I
Yeah.
haven't seen any research specifically on that relating to honey, but I've seen we know that hot plastic is a bad situation. Now, we have never first of all, we don't pasteurize honey at all at my company. I've actually no, I think one time when I was an apprentice, I pasteurized honey for someone, but I've never pasteurized honey. I mean, I haven't in a long time, and I've certainly never pasteurized it and poured it into anything but glass. So I've never even experimented with that. But I would just avoid the squeezy bear honey if it's pasteurized. Like if you're having honey that's pasteurized and you think you're getting any health benefits, you're not. It's sugar water.
Yeah, super interesting. Speaking of the carbs in honey, it's primarily fructose, right? Have you
Mhm.
done like a
Yeah, and so it's also really interesting. People think that all bee products are high sugar. And like, yes, of course, honey has sugar in it. It doesn't spike you in the same way that, regular sugar would or certain types of sweeteners do. But propolis and our Be Smart as well, those are sugar free. Those, like, I mean, first of all, there's no added sugar, but there's no added sugar in any of our products, but there's 0 grams of sugar. So we have people who are in ketosis who use propolis and Be Smart all the time. I tell those people, like, pollen might kick you out, honey will kick you out, but go for it with the Be Immune propolis spray and the Be Smart shots.
I mean, the dose ultimately is what determines whether or not something is keto or not. There's like
Yeah.
this dogma in the keto space, I mean, like a teaspoon of sugar can be keto.
Yeah.
A cup of white rice can be keto if you're exercising vigorously. I mean, it's like they're carbs, so they're sort of counterproductive to ketone production. But if that's all you're consuming in a day, are you going to be kicked out of ketosis for any significant duration? No. So when people get that obsessive, I think it can be counterproductive and a little obsessive.
Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
Extra virgin olive oil we've seen in culture, we've seen in animal studies, we've seen observationally, we've seen with randomized control trials, actually is beneficial to human health.